Hey everyone, and welcome. I am Chuck Ellis, Digital Marketing Director here at AmSpec Group. Really glad you could all join us today. If you've been following the headlines, you know things are moving fast with California's low carbon fuel standard, and this latest amendment adds major new traceability requirements, and they're reshaping how renewable fuel supply chains operate. And that's why we're here to help make sense of what's changing, who's affected, and what you can do right now to stay compliant. I'm thrilled to be joined by two fantastic speakers, Dr. Gillian DeGan, AmSpec's Executive Vice President of Business Assurance and Sustainability, and Donnie Charles, co-founder of Veriflux. They're our partners for today's session, but before we get started, just a quick reminder, there is no chat today, but you can drop your questions anytime in the Q&A panel. We'll answer as many of those as we can at the end of the session, so don't feel weird if we don't address it right away. We're going to do the whole presentation, and then at the very end, we're going to do our Q&As until we run out of time or questions, whichever comes first. And don't worry if we don't get to your question. We've got your email address, and we keep a record of all these, so we will reach out and answer your question directly afterwards if we aren't able to get to it today. Also, a reminder, in case you didn't see it in the email, a recording will be available to all registrants. So no worries if you got to jump out or if you want to revisit some stuff or show it to a colleague, you're going to get a copy of the recording in a day or two after this webinar is complete. Just another reminder, things are changing really fast. So make sure you're following AmSpec Group and Veriflux on LinkedIn. We both post pretty regularly. So make sure you're following there to stay up to date. And keep an eye out because we got more sessions like this coming up very soon. So stay tuned for the next event because things are going to be changing a lot in the near future, and that's what we're talking about today. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Gillian and let her kick things off, and excited to have you all be here.
Hi, everyone. As Chuck said, my name is Gillian DeGan. I'm with AmSpec. Just a little about AmSpec. We have been in testing, inspection, and certification for over 39 years. Our services are focused on energy and chemical and agricultural and sustainability pathways and supply chains. So we provide testing, inspection, certification, and consultancy globally. We are in over 75 countries. And my group within AmSpec is the Business Assurance and Sustainability Group. So concentrating our focus on carbon accounting, biofuel and alternative feedstock certifications, and general carbon consultancy. Donnie?
Yeah, thanks, Gil. Donnie Charles, co-founder of Veriflux, as Chuck mentioned. And to start, just want to say thank you to AmSpec for putting this together. We're honored to be a part of it. Veriflux is an end-to-end traceability and sustainability management platform. We were founded in 2020. We got funding from the US EPA in 21, launched commercially in 22, and today are in 29 countries, tracing over 420,000 supply chains, predominantly within the renewable fuels markets. That includes EPA's renewable fuel standard, 45Z, LCFS, as is the topic today, as well as CFR in Canada, CORSIA for SAF, RED 3, and the Union database within Europe. So looking forward to this conversation and diving into a number of the details about the amended LCFS.
Excellent. So we put this webinar together. We try to do it as quickly as possible to be able to kind of talk through some of these new changes to the low carbon fuel standard. So today, hopefully, we will be going over what changes did CARB make to the LCFS? And then how do these new traceability requirements affect? It could be ethanol or biodiesel producers, crush facilities, co-ops, farmers. We're talking about anyone in that complete renewable fuel supply chain. We're going to talk about how one would report the plots where feedstocks are grown. So if you've heard the word shapefile and you're wondering what that is or where you would find one, we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about attestation statements, what those cover, and how to go about getting farmers or co-ops to start signing those so you can start working on mapping the beginning of your supply chain all the way through finished fuel. We're also going to talk about what online tools are available to help you comply, and then really how to achieve compliance by that 2027 compliance date. I know it's an interesting regulation because it came out and it said compliance date of July 2025, and here we are in October. So we'll talk through really what should you be expecting as far as timeline and how and when really to get yourselves in motion to be ready by the end of 2026 to fully report. And again, if you have questions while we go through this, just drop them in the Q&A. We'll try to cover those at the end. Something that I wanted to point out, I mean, we're talking about an amended regulation today, which always makes more work for somebody, right? So with these changes coming out, people are wondering how to comply, how much extra effort, extra maybe staffing will this take? I think there is definitely a consideration that this will be a lot of work to get compliant. However, I did want to point out that in mapping these supply chains and doing all of the work to be in compliance with this amendment, it really will set up your supply chain to be compliant even in other markets. So it's kind of that silver lining. So when we're looking at changes in the amendment itself, you're going to see that like the lower your carbon intensity, the more credits you can earn. You're going to see that when we talk about the new GREET model in just a moment, that the new model recognizes things like carbon capture in a much more straightforward way. So that can be reflected in your supply chain if that's something, especially as an ethanol producer, if you decide to go that route, you can really capitalize on those investments. You'll see that in mapping your supply chain and in giving CARB this additional information, it will fall in line with 45Q and 45Z if those apply to your supply chain in a much more meaningful way. And then really being able to take all of the information that you're gathering now and use it in multiple markets. So, if you look at the Renewable Energy Directive in the EU, number 3, or you look at going towards something like an ISCC certification, all of the work you're doing now, these attestation statements, the mapping of the supply chain, all of that is the foundational work that you would need to do to get to that certification and then be able to be tradable in the EU market. Similarly, maybe you're only selling into California right now, but maybe Canada is an attractive market for you as well. So the Canadian clean fuel regulations, they really mirror what California is doing with the LCFS. So again, pulling this information together, putting in the effort here, I just wanted to point out it can benefit you in more than just being compliant with the California market.
And just to piggyback on what Gil said, there's sort of a moment in time that exists now to get this right. Understandably, there's a lot of frustration around some of these requirements. They're onerous. They go very far upstream to points where, depending on where you are in the supply chain, you may have no control over those stakeholders. And until all of this starts to work its way through the market, it's hard to kind of dictate what those requirements are going to be to folks within your supply chain. And we've seen this in parallel rollouts of requirements, like requirements for things like used cooking oil under RFS. But the point being is, the lessons learned from those prior rollouts are the early stages are when you can kind of dictate how you're going to implement this within your supply chains and make sure that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, that you can do something that makes sense, is logical, and has proven successful within other programs, and B, something that can be duplicative for those other programs. And ISCC is a really relevant reference point here, because within the amended LCFS, they specifically call out that red eligible programs can be used for certification, or red eligible schemes can be used for certification post 2027. And so as you're looking at how you're going to comply with these new requirements, part of looking at that is saying, what can I do today to not only make sure that I'm compliant remainder of 25, 26, but also 27 and post 27? How can I put myself in a position to be successful by making sure that I am getting the things I need for those additional certifications without having to go upstream multiple times with multiple requests, which is only going to make it even more difficult and kind of exacerbate the tensions that might be created within the supply chain.
Good points, Donnie. All right. So getting into it, amendments to the low carbon fuel standard. Again, that July 1, 2025 date was put out there, but really it's the message should be received as working from now, going forward, ready to report by the end of 2026. As I mentioned, you will see more aggressive carbon intensity benchmarks within the amendment. These benchmarks are getting more aggressive. We also see this automatic acceleration mechanism added where not only are they getting more aggressive now, but they will get more aggressive faster in the future. So this all points to planning now. This also makes sense when we look at the transition to the GREET 4.0 life cycle model. Within this model, you'll see the ability to get even more granular on carbon capture, being able to access additional carbon intensity savings from, lower carbon thermal energy used in your processes. And as well, if you think about mapping out your entire supply chain and understanding exactly where those plots are that your feedstocks are being grown, that means you can use a lot more granular data in your model. So rather than using like a US average for the CI value for a feedstock, you can say, okay, I know 40% of my biomass supply comes from Kansas, another 45% comes from Pennsylvania, and be able to not only use very location specific CI numbers, but also take the time now while mapping this supply chain to say, okay, if I know the CI values are higher from Pennsylvania, what can I do? What can I change in my supply chain where I can start to really have control over my CI at the end by understanding where and when I source product? So I think that's a really important point, is that it's not just about mapping the supply chain you have now, but it's also about really taking the time to examine where the carbon values are coming from, where you may have hotspots within either your process, within your sourcing, and being able to fine tune the supply chain now to be able to get the most out of the credit system later.
The name of the game is optionality. And so everything Gil just talked about speaks to maintaining that optionality, to the extent that you're a trader, that merchandising product is the worst thing you could do because it restricts the amount of demand that exists for that product, which then inherently ties to the commercial value of it. And so as you think about how you're going to implement around these amendments, to Gil's point, part of that is maintaining the optionality that you have within these specific markets, across multiple markets, as it relates to the reporting of CI and how you model against some of the new models and how you're setting up to position around future models as well. Because one thing can be certain, this is an amendment because there's a change to the program, and these programs change all the time, not exclusively California, all of them. And so being in a position to be flexible and agile around how you're able to adapt and ultimately comply with these programs is critical for maintaining the optionality of your products.
All right, so getting into a little bit more detail, tougher carbon intensity target. So we see 30% reduction by 2030 is previously set at 20%. And then if we look all the way to 2045, we're looking at a 90% reduction rather than an 85% reduction. And again, future acceleration could push those benchmarks even further. When we're looking at the new GREET model, I've mentioned a couple of different changes that you're also going to see updated fertilizer and energy emission factors. You're going to see revised co-product allocation and then new accounting again for the carbon capture and renewable process energies. So, if you're thinking about ethanol production where you have very clean, very easily capturable CO2 streams, this GREET model really highlights the efforts that are put into that and really gives you back that value in your carbon intensity calculation. For the feedstock traceability, I have a bold box around this part just because I think this is the part where people go, how in the world am I going to do this? So new requirements for crop-based feedstocks. So these GIS shape files, and these are the kind of the coordinate files that show exactly where crops are grown. Donnie, do you want to talk a little bit about like what is a shape file?
Yeah. So a shapefile is basically a boundary mapping of a particular plot. So if you were to think about just to give an easy concept, if you were to think about a home and the edge of the home is obviously the fence of the home that surrounds the yard. A shapefile is just kind of the geofence that exists around that plot that says here's where we can demarcate the lines or the boundaries or the borders of that particular plot. And shapefiles can come in a number of different formats. Esri is one of the most conventionally used technical systems around that. KML, GeoJSON, there's a number of different formats that exist for shapefiles. Fundamentally, what California is getting at with the shapefile requirement is they want to know where crops are sourced from for supply chains that ultimately get used for fuel into California. And so their end goal is that you as a pathway holder in most cases will be able to produce a list of all of the boundary maps of all of the farmland that is used for a crop-based feedstock for fuel that's part of a California pathway that ultimately gets used within the LCFS program. So that's kind of the intent behind shapefiles. Now, Chuck said this at the beginning that things are kind of dynamic right now. There was an LCFS implementation FAQ that was released by California a couple of weeks ago that has a couple of resources around how they're thinking about the actual implementation of that. There's rumored to be guidance around the implementation forthcoming any day now. So these things are still very much in flux. That said, we do know that the intent of the amendment is for these shapefiles to be available for all crop-based feedstock origins for feedstock traceability purposes.
Thanks. I think that's really helpful. One other thing I'll share just on shapefiles, if any of you on the call are familiar with EU deforestation regulation, some people will also refer to these as just the polygons, because not every growing plot is necessarily a rectangle. So if you hear people say the polygons, they're also talking about something very similar. It's the same as a shapefile or these other kind of GIS coordinates.
And one of the underlying questions there is, will California accept a lat long in lieu of a shapefile to start? And again, the implementation FAQ kind of speaks to some of those different things, but that's kind of some of the implementation nuance is what are they ultimately going to require in what format at what periods of time, and what is that going to look like? And part of that is also in terms of just reporting. Do you have to report very specifically the boundaries that exist for the crop plots, or can you over report? Can you report areas where you suspect that you might source from, but that, is enough to cover definitely where you do source from, but might include some excess area. So that over reporting question, that's where kind of the rubber meets the road on the devil being in the details around how this is ultimately going to be implemented. But technically speaking, the shapefiles themselves, the equivalent of the polygons in Europe, they're basically just meant to be the boundaries of the areas where you're sourcing material from.
All right. So to accompany the shapefiles, California is also looking for attestation letters. So these would be letters signed by growers verifying that sustainable practices were used. It does seem fairly daunting to think about, okay, am I going to get every farmer to sign a letter? This really, I think this probably puts people in a panic more than most things. Donnie, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of maybe what some options are in that?
Yeah, and this is where it's another good example of the devil will be in the details. But the inherent idea behind it is that across your supply chain and across supply chains writ large, there will be attestations on file for every node in the supply chain that speaks to the fact that particular part of the supply chain meets the required sustainability practices, whether it's around deforestation or other specific practices. Now, what we don't know yet is what that implementation will look like in practice. Will it be a single attestation that you need from a crush facility that kind of covers its full supply chain? And then there might be commercial liability that exists for that particular crush facility. Is it the pathway holder that has to have an attestation on file? Will it need to go all the way back to the farm level, or maybe it could be the first gathering point? With the specified source feedstocks, which are things like used cooking oil or animal fats, the intent is for it to, and this is not necessarily new, although it certainly is codified as part of the amendment. The intent is for every single node of the supply chain to not only be known, but to be attested to by each node in the supply chain, and for those attests to be on file and available for verifiers. If crop-based feedstocks follow that same model, then we get to a point where, at a minimum, that kind of first gathering point, the co-op or perhaps the crush facility needs to test everything upstream of them, if not even further, because the point of origin is, in fact, the farm. And that's where, as much as we talk about multi-market access and all these different programs, there is a ton of opportunity to be able to do things to prepare for that. But the flip side of that is not all of these programs are in alignment. Point of origin, as far as California is concerned, is different from point of origin as the federal government has outlined in some of the proposed RVO changes from this past June. So in that sense, there's a lot of confusion, understandably so, that might exist upstream within the market, because imagine going to a co-op and saying, hey, I need you to sign this attestation. And a week earlier, they heard that the point of origin is the crush facility as determined by the EPA. And then you have to explain to them, this is for California, it's for a different program. So lots of confusion that exists there. The good news, though, is that for things like ISCC, all of these same practices exist there, where you have to get declarations from the point of origin, where you have to be able to show the transfer of sustainable material from one node to another. And so even if ultimately the strictest interpretations hold true for the initial implementation, a lot of the work that you're doing today will still be valuable for the post-27 certification requirement under the amended LCFS.
Good points. Good points. Additional considerations under feedstock traceability. So enhanced third-party verification. We spoke about the modified or the new GREET model being used. This is also something where you will need pathways verified and then resubmitted to CAR as part of this. So using that new model, having an LCFS verifier, approved verifier, do that verification, that is also going to be part of kind of moving forward on this reporting. As far as timing, contracts and plantings prior to July 1 can be grandfathered in, but any contracts after that date, that's what needs to comply with these mapping and these different verification rules going forward. If we look at it as a compliance roadmap, I think, we're trying to boil down something incredibly complicated to something simple in this slide, but really stepwise is taking a look at your supply chain, recalculating your pathway with this new GREET model. And then obviously while doing that, the point being not only to use the new compliant model, but also to really reduce your carbon intensity through process and energy optimization. On my staff at AmSpec, we have a number of life cycle assessment professionals that not only work with renewable fuels pathways, but also can do kind of hotspot detection. So if you need help looking at your supply chain, understanding where you may be able to realize some savings in that carbon intensity number, life cycle professionals, these are the folks that would help you do that. And then really implementation of chain of custody, traceability, and GIS capabilities. We said we would kind of highlight what types of online tools can help with that step. So I'm going to let Donnie talk a little bit about Veriflux.
Yeah, and I think it's important here to highlight that, especially when we're talking about what we bring to bear from a Veriflux perspective as a technology solution, that it's not so much that the data doesn't exist, but it's being able to bring together all the data so you can have a comprehensive view of the full chain of custody of your supply chains and the eligibility across the different markets that you're trying to ultimately commercialize that product within. And so GIS capabilities and kind of the shapefiles is a perfect example. There are ways today that you can go about getting shapefiles, and you certainly don't need to just use a traceability platform to be able to do that. But being able to marry that GIS information with who you're procuring from, who they're procuring from, the anonymization of some of those commercially sensitive details, because understandably so, there's a lot of non-linear supply chains where folks are competing against one another, and this data is sensitive to them. And so being able to kind of bring that all together and then have that data be represented and available in ways that are compliant across different programs, that's really where it becomes most critical. And again, to use a parallel, this is what we saw when we saw some of the RFS record keeping requirements roll out following the 23, 24, 25 proposed RVO, which was initially proposed in 22 and then was adopted in 23. And chief among those was used cooking oil, which, for those that aren't familiar, used cooking oil comes from restaurants. It then goes through pretty dynamic supply chains before it's converted into biodiesel, renewable diesel, SAF, so renewable products like that. And in many ways, it's a perfect analogy to some of these crop-based feedstocks, because you're dealing with thousands, if not tens of thousands of points of origin. You're dealing with folks in the supply chain that are competitive with one another, for whom the data is sensitive and they treat it as confidential business information. And so being able to map that, store that, have it available to a verifier, supplement it with things like analysis around reduction of CI or energy optimization or whatever it may be. That's really when you start to view kind of the comprehensive opportunity that exists within these kind of compliance issues. And so what we were encouraging folks in 22, 23 as this came out was, don't view this as a one-time, I have to do this just to get it over with and rip the Band-Aid off type of thing. View this as an opportunity to put in place the foundation to build on top of that an optionality type of opportunity for your sustainable products. And in many ways, that's the same situation here. Don't treat this as a one-off where you have to just go out and get a sheet file or try to organize a couple of attestations. Don't get me wrong, that's not easy. And I get it. It sucks, for lack of a better term. But view this as an opportunity to put in place the right strategic guardrails and foundation to be able to make sure that you can continue to meet these requirements across this program, Canada, Europe, et cetera. And so that's kind of where we come into play from both a software and a technical perspective.
Excellent. And then honestly, I feel like this working from now through the end of 26 is the final steps are resubmission of those pathways, really planning credit and deficit management, and then also budgeting for verifications and mapping costs through 2026. I know it probably feels like a little bit of a moving target right now, and all of us are actually kind of salivating for a little bit more detail, a little bit more guidance. But really, I think what I would suggest is working with, number one, low carbon fuel standard verified life cycle assessment professionals, and then working with a robust system that can map your supply chain and that you can really grow into to handle this hurdle that you're going to have to jump now, and then really that, handle that optionality for the future. As more information comes out on this, as more information comes out on things like land use with CARB and low carbon fuel standard, you will see more information out there from AmSpec, from Veriflux. We will do more of these webinars. We are happy to entertain calls, question and answers, brainstorming sessions for any of our clients. But both of our groups work together on a regular basis, and we are here to help with each step along the way.
And just to reiterate from a Veriflux perspective, our goal is to help you kind of organize the data, work with your upstream partners, suppliers, et cetera, to make sure that you have all the data you need to comply not just with the immediate rollout and implementation of this program, but with the optionality that you ultimately hope to achieve as this program continues to evolve and as other programs similarly continue to evolve for both crop-based feedstocks and the non-crop-based feedstocks under LCFS. And that, those are the specified source feedstocks like used cooking oil, like tallow, that have just as, if not greater, requirements, because you have to do things like trace energy usage at the rendering facility and things like that. So we're here to help and work together with partners like AmSpec to be able to provide a comprehensive compliance solution for you.
Well, good. Chuck, can you give us some of the questions that people have submitted? I think we can go through those.
Absolutely. We've had quite a few good questions come in. I'm going to start with this one. It says, you give ISCC as an example. Any thoughts about the comparison between ISCC and RSB? Given that CA, California, has said ISC and RSB are both examples of sustainability certification systems they are considering for the LCFS certification.
Yep, I can talk a little bit about that. So ISCC and RSB are similar in the fact that they're certifying sustainable practices in biofuels. The way the systems work are a bit different. I know within RSB there's like an application to have that certification by a company. There's actually there's a waiting period, and almost like I'm going to call it a vote, for lack of a better term, of whether or not a certification should be put out there. In ISCC, the scheme is very straightforward. With you go to a certifying body, the audit is done of your supply chain, and if the certifying body says that you match or exceed the requirements for the scheme, the certification is then given to the supply chain or to the client. So I know that it's a little bit different with the way kind of the technical committee works on that. Technical committee at ISCC would receive the audit report from the auditor and then make a determination on their own. It would not be a shared thought exercise with people outside of that certifying body. Additionally, just some other stuff about ISCC. There are different types of ISCC if you're not familiar. There's ISCC EU, which is more biomass, crop-based feedstocks. There's ISCC Plus, which is more like circular economy. So think about recycled plastics as feedstocks. And then, of course, for sustainable aviation fuel, there's the ISCC Corsia. That's very specific to the aviation fuel area. Other than that, Donnie, do you have any things you want to point out, kind of contrasting those?
Yeah, within the context of the California amendment, again, as it's currently written from an implementation perspective, ISCC EU would be the parallel, because that's the one that is in response to the Renewable Energy Directive RED 2, RED 3. So ISCC EU is the scheme that's specific to that. RSB is another RED approved certification scheme. And then there are others. There's ones like Red Cert. There's a handful of them. And so it's certainly not just ISCC. It's not just ISCC and RSB. There's a number that, again, as currently written, would qualify for California. Part of the distinction there is the reason why ISCC has become in many ways synonymous with RED is because it's the most widely used of the EU RED certification schemes. By last check, I think it had between 14 and 15,000 certified companies under the scheme globally. So that just gives you a kind of a sense of the scale that ISCC has. And it's why, as California is looking at ways for post 27 to allow for some sort of crossover, ISCC is so frequently talked about. It's just because of the sheer scale that they have within the market.
Chuck, do we have
All
another
right.
question?
Yes, we do. We've got CARB's LCFS regulations state that shapefiles or coordinates are needed for farms, but there seems to be some question about whether that is, quote, fields. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah. My view is that rules as they're written and put forward by regulators, often have terminology that may or may not align with commercial realities. And so honestly, I think part of the distinction there is not necessarily knowing the difference between a farm or a field. I think the intent, and we'll see if this holds true in the implementation guidance when it's issued, but I think the intent is it's meant for the boundaries of wherever you are sourcing your feedstock from, and how you define that could be on a field or on a farm level. Again, just kind of depending on the degree to which you have granularity of that type of information. That would be my guess. But I don't think it's fair to expect California regulators to be expert on all the terminologies across the hundreds of thousands of supply chains that hit California. And this is kind of just a result of that, is you end up with terminology that may or may not perfectly align with some of the commercial realities on the ground.
Okay. We got another question here. It says, is traceability likely to be on a material balancing basis, i.e. providing shapefiles to cover any CA-bound feedstock/fuel?
Yeah, and my understanding is that is the intent within LCFS currently for feedstocks. There is permitted mass balancing on a per location basis, and so it seems likely that would be the case. But again, we'll have to see kind of what the implementation guidelines show. Material and mass balancing is an interesting example of kind of the prior question around terminology. Canada under CFR refers to material balancing, and they actually have a slightly distinct interpretation of material balancing relative to mass balancing under other programs. Their material balancing is a formula that's called Q incoming plus Q inventory. So it's basically an aggregate of what you have coming into your facility, contracted, anticipated, et cetera, plus what you have existing in inventory. Is kind of the boundaries of your material balance. ISCC, in contrast for EU, your mass balance is restricted to your system boundary. So what's actually inside of your boundary. So it would be the equivalent of Q inventory under that formula. And so it shows you that even though these programs, again, are intended to kind of accomplish the same thing, subtle distinctions there can impact ultimately how you're measuring what is or isn't eligible under which programs. But to answer the original question, yeah, I think the intent is for it to be on a material balance basis.
Okay. Thank you for putting this talk together. Relative to contracts or plantings before July 1st, 2025, are all soybean/canola oil planted before July 1st qualified, regardless of whether it was contracted for crushing or the oil produced contracted?
So I'll say what I've said before, just as the boilerplate asterisk, which is it remains to be seen what will be in the guidance. And so anything that I say now, don't hold against me if the guidance says otherwise. That said, I think based off the FAQ and some of the comments that California made recently at, in particular, the LCFS conference in Monterey a few weeks ago, my understanding is that California intends to provide a safe harbor that allows an either or of that before July 1, 2025. So either it was planted before or it was contracted before, and you kind of have the flexibility to apply safe harbor based off of which one of those is most favorable to your particular situation. Again, we have to see what the guidance shows, but my understanding is there's a bit of a safe harbor built into that. And I think that more broadly, the thing to understand is, and this is in the implementation FAQ, and it's very clear that California is saying it this way, is they're saying two things at the same time. One, California, we understand that this is going to be difficult to comply with and that there's a lot of complexities here. And so we are going to provide leniency in as much as if you show you're making good faith effort on these, you have time and space to implement this. That's what they're saying on the one hand. On the other hand, what they're also saying is we're serious about this amendment and these rules as written, and we intend to enforce them. We intend to enforce them with verifications, certifications, external certifications, and ultimately our own certification that we're going to set up. And so while we're going to give you time and space, as long as you're showing good faith efforts, while we're going to give you safe harbor, as long as you're showing good faith efforts in the onset, in the long term, that is with the intent of fully implementing this. And that's where we're going. And so I think that's pretty clear from the FAQs.
All right. Similar to the distinction and question around field and farm, is CARB going to adopt the same definition for farm as ISCC, which includes all land leased and owned that are part of the grower's legal entity, or would these sustainability rules just apply to fields growing biofuel crops?
It's a good question. And I think the most honest answer is we don't know yet. But we do know that once they accept red certifications post 27, that the ISCC definition should be something that is acceptable to them, or is something that they intend to use. So I don't know whether they'll go with that or they'll just apply it to the fields growing the biofuel crops. The honest answer is not only I don't know, or we don't know until that goes until we get the guidance around it, but in some ways, while certainly one is slightly more difficult than the other, it still doesn't change the fact that all of this is going to be onerous. And so kind of getting it right up front is important. And what we saw to use the parallel here, what we saw with used cooking oil back in 22, 23 was there was a lot of, I'd say, there was a lot of incentive to kind of wait until everything was defined, or perceived incentive to wait until everything was defined. Until we know this, and this, I don't want to go out and fully implement this because, what if I'm wrong? But the difference between a farm and a field, while it's an important distinction, ultimately isn't going to change whether or not you can map chain of custody from the farm or the field all the way through the supply chain. And so what I would encourage is, to the extent that there are still things that may remain undefined after the guidance, those are going to be the outliers and the things that are going to be the final things to implement. Everything else I would try as much as possible to get a head start on, because while those things are certainly important to be fully compliant, everything else is the equivalent of both the foundation and the walls and the insulation and the ceiling. And some of those subtle distinctions are more so, the final finishings of the home analogy.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. I know that from our perspective, we are starting to answer questions as best we can on this amendment. We will be pushing out as much new information as we get it, and trying to make it as easy to understand and be there to help people comply. I know that we are both staffing up within our groups, so we are ready to hit the ground with those that are ready to map their supply chains. So more information to come for sure. And these have been great questions, you guys. Thank you.
Yes, thanks everyone for asking these questions. We've still got time for a few more, so if you've got any questions, be sure to ask in the Q&A section. Here's one. It says, I'm concerned I won't be able to get stakeholders to sign my attestations. Is there an efficient and easy way to do this?
Yeah, and that concern is a fair and a very real one. It's in part, it's a concern because while we all are taking the time to try to understand these and to be on webinars where we can learn more about these specific changes and the amendment, it's unfair to expect folks who day in, day out are growing crops or are participating in a co-op or, are part of a crush operation to necessarily dive deep into the weeds of these regulations. And so the first time that some of them will hear about this will be from you as you're trying to engage them on what you need from them. And again, we saw this as a parallel in used cooking oil the first time that used cooking oil collectors or even restaurants, to the extent that they needed to be declared under a program like ISCC, would hear about some of these things would be when an aggregator or a trader, kind of the equivalent of a crush plant or a trader within the crop-based supply chains, would approach those upstream of them and say, hey, I need you to be able to facilitate this. And so what that means is when you go for that approach, that engagement, you want to make sure that you're doing it with kind of a single ask. So in my experience, if your goal is post 27 to be ISCC certified and 25, 26 to kind of get the shapefiles and perhaps the attestations, depending on what the final implementation rule is around that, instead of going and asking for first the shapefiles and the boundaries, and then ultimately going back a year later and asking for a declaration under ISCC, better to upfront approach them once, give them the context, explain to them the amendment, have some material prepared around that, and then go in and say, hey, I need this, 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 and this. It's one ask, and then you're set for those different programs. And so that's part of my recommendation. The other recommendation I would have is give folks as many easy ways as possible to get you what you need back. So don't just say, hey, I need you to sign this. What's an email? I can send it to you. You want to be able to provide things that need to be signed or documents that you need back or whatever, email, text, WhatsApp. You want to make it as simple on site in person with a tablet, or allow them to take a photo of the signed doc and send it back to you. You need to be multimodal in being able to get this data back. And that's the approach fundamentally we take within our system, is we try to make it as easy as possible for folks to bring data back. Because if you don't, then you're just adding, in addition to the tension and the friction around a regulation that they may never have heard of, you're also adding the tension and the friction around having to add something to their workflow that is outside the norm of what they do on a day-to-day basis. And it just makes it more complicated.
All right. We got another one here. With the requirement that biomass crop land having been in active management since 1st of January 2008 and in use or fallow, it is a one-time review back to 2008, or do you have to check each year in between?
So interesting question. So this is, if people are wondering, this is getting into a bit more about like the land use changes under LCFS. Donnie, I don't know if you have anything to add here. What I will say is we will actually be doing a whole separate set of webinars as we find out more details from CARB on land use. We will be talking a lot about that because it's something that's been talked about, but I would say really not detailed, where we can get down to like that granular of a level.
Yeah, and typically what we've seen when you add in deforestation requirements, EUDR, especially as it relates to palm, which obviously is not the topic at hand, but it's just kind of a parallel. Typically it's since whatever date has existed. So you're essentially saying since 2008 in this example that it hasn't had that. And so your kind of ongoing recertification, if you want to call that, it's just basically saying nothing has changed since the last time I made this claim.
Hopefully that helps, but look out for more detailed sessions in the future on the land use.
All right. Great questions, everybody. And again, we got, I think, time for one, maybe two more questions. So let's see. I think we talked about this a little bit, but when will the final guidance be available for implementation of all these changes? And how do I know this won't change again in the future?
So rumored that there will be a guidance shortly. I mean, it could be as early as this week. That said, I like to joke with guidances that if you've ever had a Word doc that you were editing and you saved it as final, and then you realized something needed to be changed, and so then you saved it as final, and then you realized again something needed to be changed, so you say, is final really final this time? Guidances are kind of like that. So, even if we get a guidance this week, I'm sure there will still be additional guidances in the future because it won't address everything, such as, a lot of the really outstanding questions we've gotten here.
Yeah. And that being said, I think it's important to point out that like we try to stay as close to the regulatory bodies as possible. So not only to see the guidances, the minute they come out, we do try to get a heads up. I know Donnie is really close to CARB. I know my LCFS approved verifiers try to keep in the mix of these things as well. So as these things get released, please come to us to have conversations about really kind of the intent of the document and what compliance can look like on a practical level.
All right. I think we got time for one more question. If anybody wants to leave that in the chat, I got one more one that I can address here while people make their final notes. Let's see, how do crop-based requirements differ from specified source feedstock requirements?
Yes, the way I would think about that is specified source feedstock requirements, which I would dare anyone to say that 10 times fast. They're sort of, in my view, the canary in the coal mine, especially because as we look at international pathways tied to those specified source feedstocks, we know they've gotten significantly more, I don't want to say restrictive, but data intensive. It used to be the case that a lot of those feedstocks had generic pathways. Then it became regional, like South American tallow. Then it became country specific, like Brazilian tallow. And then, the intent as kind of has been expressed through public comments is that it'll ultimately become supply chain specific. And so what does that really teach us? It teaches us that, as CARB has said around the crop-based stuff as well, their goal is really to know where everything is coming from and how it got from where it started to the California market. And whether that is something that happens overnight, which won't be the case because they are providing a little bit of that safe harbor, or whether it's something that'll happen incrementally, which is certainly more likely the case. Nevertheless, their intent is clear. They want to be able to map supply chains. They want to be able to understand the eligibility of feedstock that's going into fuels, that's going into their market, and ultimately they want to understand the carbon intensity of what they would say the true carbon intensity of those fuels that is coming into their market, so that they can determine whether or not they're hitting their GHG targets that were outlined earlier. So that's why those specified source feedstocks, in many ways, I think are kind of an indication of where everything is going, is because they have already shown us that the CARB is getting more intensive on all of this.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Gillian and Donnie, and thank you all for joining us today. Hope the session was helpful and helped clarify what the amended LCFS means for you and your teams. If we didn't get to a question that you have, or you get one later, don't worry. Gil and Donnie will be happy to follow up by email after the event. Their contact information is up on your screen now. Just a quick reminder, the full recording of this session will be sent to all registrants, so you'll be able to revisit any part of it or share it with your colleagues as you would prefer. And don't forget, again, we're on LinkedIn, AmSpec Group and Veriflux, both posting regularly as updates happen and keeping people informed. We'll have more sessions like this. You'll see announcements of those on our LinkedIn's and probably in your inbox because we have your email now. So stay tuned for that. And again, if you have any questions, we're always happy to help. So thanks again for spending part of your day with us. We really appreciate it. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one.